Today we'll begin with Thomas Green's cheerful assessment that it's too late for a workers' revolution and that the plutocracy would sooner nuke us than share. And although Thomas offers some hope that we will be able to bail out our sinking ship, we have another article that gives us other advice. From Red Flag again. U.S. history proves it. Change comes from struggle, not elections. The most hopeful part of this article is the revelation that U.S. soldiers in Vietnam were also protesting the war. So if soldiers and police join us in our protests, then we definitely have a chance. As always, I'll link to the article underneath the video, and definitely follow Thomas if you are a Medium subscriber. The U.S. federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour is suitable only for teenagers. It is an expression of our snarling contempt toward the working poor. Can you imagine being unable to reject this insult because no one willing to hire you is offering more? Millions of American adults with actual adult responsibilities experience this humiliation routinely. The Clintonites plotted the downward trajectory with NAFTA and their new economy hustle, which broke the unions, crippled the working class, and cultivated a vast crop of service sector working poor. Subsequent Democratic and Republican administrations and their powerful clients have successfully proletarianized every citizen holding less than a baccalaureate degree. Below that cutoff, most Americans, regardless of race, age, location, or party, are forced to tolerate identical dead-end gigs where they can aspire only to identical dead-end managerial posts. The elimination of blue-collar careers has driven the cost of labor so low that among unskilled and semi-skilled workers, the employed are barely distinguishable from the unemployed. Imagine the embarrassment of working a 60-hour-per-week gig with no benefits that leaves you unable to afford anything that might indicate to others that you work for a living. Tens of millions of Americans know it firsthand. Cheap labor has propelled income inequality to a place beyond our imaginations. No one has an intuitive grasp of trillions of dollars. It's all just numbers, a fact that works to the advantage of those who control and milk the system. Everyone knows what it's like to be a few hundred short at the end of the month, but 30,000 times 10 million is completely abstract. The numbers are so bloodless that we're unable to compare our crummy little salary to some plutocrat's $20 billion fortune. It's like trying to imagine a four-dimensional object. We can't hope to eradicate corporations and billionaires. They're embedded in all things threatening: police, military, three-letter agencies, etc. And let's not forget the resources they command. Multinational corporations, commercial banks, central banks, multinational insurance agencies, major pension funds, and investment banks and funds. They will prevail easily in the kind of workers' revolution that many dream of as a last hope. Hell, they've defeated us already. Let me break in here, Thomas, and say it's not as hopeless as you portray, especially since police officers and military personnel are human beings that might be able to be swayed. Even intelligence personnel have the ability to be swayed. Yes, there are good guys even inside the CIA and FBI. Believe it if you will. Back to Thomas. Consider the vast spending on surveillance and data mining technology and artificial intelligence that flowed from the USA Patriot Act and a post-9/11 mentality that permitted the integration of law enforcement, national security, intelligence, and military support agencies. The United States got into the surveillance and data mining rackets in a big way, throwing around the kind of money that only governments can raise. But again, Thomas, there are good guys who understand this technology. And there are still heroes who are willing to share the ensuing data leaks. Congress and the Bush administration poured hundreds of billions of dollars into Silicon Valley's research and development budgets. This was a moonshot magnitude collaboration, and its payoff was a leap in data mining bandwidth and AI competence and pervasiveness by several orders of magnitude. The so-called security industrial complex was born. It grew so rapidly that by 2004, the National Security Agency, NSA, had the ability to monitor all of the telephone and email traffic routed through the United States, which it did at will without warrants. There was a years-long court struggle over its legality, but in 2007, the Bush administration canceled the program voluntarily. Sure it did. It was replaced with another NSA product, codenamed PRISM, which relies on commercial data providers. The system works because Google, Amazon, eBay, Facebook, Apple, et al. Have the ability to monitor all of us all of the time. The power to scrutinize human lives in minute detail that we've entrusted to private interest behemoths is unprecedented. Any totalitarian Soviet surveillance state would have sacrificed a generation of its firstborn for a mere taste of the data we voluntarily surrender to information brokers and advertisers as we go about our daily routines using Google, YouTube, Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, SMS, WhatsApp, Pinterest, Imgur, Skype, Zoom, Steam, Origin, Twitch, Amazon, PayPal, Netflix, eBay, Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, OnStar, TikTok, webmail, Tinder, Grindr, Uber, and Lyft, not to mention several 100,000 minor phone apps and casual games. The bots sifting our communications in search of violent intentions and extremist views are married to the same invisible electronic pimps and touts that guide us toward goods and services, entertainment and games, news and information, and virtual communities tailored to our personal idiosyncrasies and patterns of consumption. Your experience of the world is censored and curated in ways you would never suspect. And the bots are learning all the time. We're at a point where it's reasonable to wonder if any of our beliefs are truly original, uncontaminated by AI influence. Corporate entities control nearly all of the world's information, and they feed it to us selectively in service of their interests. We can't physically fight a plutocracy composed primarily of Silicon Valley titans, the defense industry, the entertainment industry, and Wall Street firms. They are all protected by government agencies. But again, Thomas, there are some actual honest-to-goodness human beings inside of all of these institutions. And an honest-to-goodness rebellion would enlist a certain portion of these human beings. Back to Thomas. Those guys would nuke a small American city to keep us in line if they could get away with it. Naturally, the plot would leak almost immediately, but if it were practically feasible, there would be no moral impediment, no reluctance on ethical grounds. I can easily picture Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg in a bidding war to decide which of them gets to press the button. Now this next part, Thomas, I have to disagree with in advance. The plutocrats do have a fear of violence in the streets. They especially have a fear of property damage. Most of their shit burns. I hope the good guys in those three-letter agencies you mentioned are listening to this, and not the bad guys. Back to Thomas. Don't imagine that the plutocrats have any fear of violence in the streets. September 11th was a hell of a lesson. All of their really important stuff is protected with military-grade security now. Much of it resides deep underground in heavily fortified campuses that look like office parks. They'll put down a violent struggle without breaking a sweat. They've got all the brainwashed meat in uniform they need, plus a mass surveillance and propaganda apparatus of immense power. They'll gladly tell us what to think. Have you ever wondered why Americans appear to have lost their enthusiasm for BLM protests? It's because compliant media outlets circulated images that made the protesters look disreputable to the lightweight liberals who woke up and flirted, briefly, with the idea of racial justice. It doesn't take much to intimidate barely middle-class suburbanites paranoid about slipping down a rung socially. People who agonize over getting a tasteful little tattoo in a spot easily covered because some future job interviewer might notice it. Okay, Thomas, you're right that it doesn't take much to intimidate barely middle-class suburbanites. But I'm hoping we can get this movement started without them. First things first. The Republicans and the Democrats have got us balkanized around social issues that cover every possible grievance except economic justice. Poverty-level dead-end gigs are the cost of glory on the partisan battlefield these days. The big three social issues are abortion, guns, and the environment. We've been conditioned to believe that if we yield an inch on any of those fronts, catastrophe will follow. Whether you wish to preserve abortion rights or curtail them, impose new gun control laws, or repeal the ones we have, protect the environment, or coddle the industries threatening it is of no consequence. The tiniest movement toward the other side's position must be halted, even at the cost of decent career opportunities and a national minimum wage suitable for an adult. Our preoccupation with official social issues has kept us disorganized and poor. That is the ghetto of partisan competition in which we've been segregated by the media, politicians, and their powerful clients. They've chosen the issues for us. One's guaranteed to keep us angry at each other so that the elites can swindle us. The only way forward is to unite the lower income ranks, the working poor, both left and right-leaning, within a third political party focused on economic justice. Forget about reforming the Democratic or Republican parties. They serve only the elites, despite their vague populist overtures. We need a political party that will speak for the former working class, today's working poor, and represent their interests zealously. We might end up with a three-party system involving lots of pendulum swinging and improbable temporary coalitions, but we would begin to tame the plutocrats and corporations with pressure from a sturdy coalition big enough to mount strikes with meaningful consequences. We have got to put economic justice and equality first and everything else after. We can worry about guns and abortions and green energy once we've secured the right of collective bargaining for every worker and ensured economic equality and justice for every citizen, regardless of age, race, or sex. When I say economic justice is paramount, I don't mean to dismiss the grievances of women and minorities. I mean only to assert that unequal access to housing, education, and job opportunities are a consequence of unjust hiring policies and employment conditions. Social justice is the most important virtue of all, but it is the child of economic justice. Ultimately, we have only those rights and privileges that we can afford to exercise. So first things first. So there was a hopeful ending after all. It wasn't altogether bleak. And now we turn to U.S. history proves it. Change comes from struggle, not elections. Pinning hopes on the outcome of elections has weakened social movements. When the oppressed take matters into their own hands, things change. This is by Eleanor Morley from just a couple of days ago. And I'll remind you that Red Flag is an Australian publication. The United States this year was rocked by the biggest mass rebellion in its history. Black Lives Matter protests ripped through more than 2,000 different towns and cities, attracting millions of people in a multiracial rebellion that changed the political landscape. Many have had their first experience of protesting, marching and chanting alongside thousands of others united on the streets. Some have become political leaders, carrying crowds of thousands with chants against Trump and the police, storming barricades erected to protect statues glorifying the country's racist history, and participating in meetings to organize rolling protests. This new generation of rebels has also inspired people around the world, spreading mass anti-racist protests to London, Seoul, Sydney, and beyond. But the energy unleashed by the rebellion starting in May is being swamped by the electoral circus of Biden versus Trump. This is bad news for anyone hoping to see transformative change in the US or in other parts of the world, for the reach of US politics is truly global. Socialists have always argued that the way we fight for our rights is through mass demonstrations, strikes, and activism, not pinning hopes on bourgeois elections. This is particularly the case in the United States, where politics is dominated by two giant parties of the business class. Collective resistance affects the consciousness of protesters in a way unrivaled by the atomizing experience of the ballot box. Rehearsals for revolution is how British socialist activist and art critic John Berger described the character of mass demonstrations, not strategic or even tactical ones, but rehearsals of revolutionary awareness. Mass demonstrations don't just change the political consciousness of those who attend, they are also, along with strikes, the most effective way we have to force progressive change from politicians. With the presidential election just weeks away, days away, The left in the US is faced with a choice to campaign and vote, however reluctantly, for a Biden presidency, or to try to harness the radical energy and spread the struggles of 2020 while rebuilding new layers of revolutionary political leadership and organization. Some argue the two things are not counterposed, but the history of US politics teaches us that the circus of the election cycle sucks the wind out of mass movements instead of inflating them. The radical struggles of the 1930s and 1960s, when workers and the oppressed won their greatest victories, are a testament to this. The Great Depression is remembered by liberals of all stripes as the time when Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt took on the industrialists to fight for the livelihoods of impoverished workers. While Roosevelt did at times clash with sections of capital over the most effective strategy to restore profitability, legislated reforms were a product of and response to the greatest upsurge of labor militancy in the 20th century. 3 mass strikes in 1934 won union recognition and wage raises in Toledo, Minneapolis, and San Francisco, inspiring a nationwide upswing in working-class militancy. This was the backdrop to the president's second New Deal in 1935-36, which contained more concessions to workers than the first New Deal of 1933-34. For example, the National Labor Relations Act made it illegal for employers to refuse to bargain with unions, and the Social Security Act provided economic support for the most impoverished workers and the elderly. Although Roosevelt promised workers during his re-election bid in 1936 that we have only just begun to fight, 1935 proved to be the high watermark of reforms under his administrations. While many workers caught up in waves of industrial rebellion began to move beyond Democratic Party politics, their union leaders and the Communist Party pulled out every stop to divert working-class energy into Roosevelt's re-election campaign. Hey, when have we seen that recently? This squandered a historic opportunity to build a mass workers' party in opposition to the two dominant parties of American capitalism. 30 years later, during the 1964 presidential elections, voters were presented with two undesirable choices. Barry Goldwater, arch-reactionary and warmonger, stood for the Republicans. Lyndon B. Johnson, who had already been in office for a year and started the military buildup in Vietnam, but promised not to escalate it, ran as the Democratic nominee. He promised. He paid lip service, and he got reelected. That was me, if you couldn't tell. Large sections of the peace movement and the left decided to go half the way with LBJ, a slogan reminiscent of today's "Settle for Biden," pledging to vote and campaign for Johnson as the lesser evil to Goldwater. However, almost immediately on retaking office, Johnson escalated the war, which by its conclusion had slaughtered more than 3 million people. This next paragraph is worth the price of admission, people. Heroic resistance from the Vietnamese soldiers and civilians dovetailed with a rebellion in the army and a mass protest movement in the U.S. The Tet Offensive in 1968, a major escalation by the Vietnamese resistance, brought the National Liberation Front into the heart of Saigon, the capital of the occupied south of the country. The uprising spread to dozens of other towns controlled by U.S. forces and the South Vietnamese puppet regime. While the U.S. military eventually stopped the offensive, it marked a crucial turning point for the fortunes of U.S. imperialism in Vietnam. I want to hear more about this rebellion in the army. If that's really a thing, information about it is scarce, to say the least. Back to the story. In the United States, the anti-war movement began drawing crowds of hundreds of thousands. When President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia in 1970, students at more than 100 campuses went on strike. After 4 student activists were shot and killed by the National Guard at Kent State University, the strike spread to more than 400 colleges. I actually remember hearing about that. A generation was becoming radicalized and mobilized, but the nail in the coffin for Nixon's strategy was the resistance of the soldiers stationed in Vietnam. I realize I'm saying Vietnam and Vietnam because as a kid I heard it one way, and then as an adult I heard it another way. The power of movements on the streets and in workplaces is also evident in more recent times. In 2006, when a Republican bill to criminalize undocumented migrants passed the House and moved to the Senate, more than 1 million people left their workplaces and flooded the streets in a mass action called A Day Without an Immigrant. In the lead up to a May Day strike, there were rallies of hundreds of thousands of migrant workers, students, and anti-racist activists, which built formidable resistance to the legislation. Following the strike, the bill was a dead letter. I don't remember hearing about that, do you? I must have been at brunch, right? Much of the organizational energy that had gone into building the movement turned its focus to the midterm elections and then the 2008 presidential election, captured by the popular slogan, "Today we march, tomorrow we vote." The hopes of millions of harassed and oppressed immigrants were pinned on a presidential victory for Barack Obama. But after being elected on a pro-immigrant platform, he soon became the deporter-in-chief, kicking out more undocumented immigrants than all preceding presidents combined. How's that for hope and change, people? In 2018, teachers in West Virginia, the safest Republican state in the country, inspired workers across the U.S. when a planned 2-day strike demanding a 5% pay increase for all state public sector workers blew out to 8 days of wildcat strikes. State senators tried to demonize the teachers as selfish and sabotaging children's education. Negotiators tried to buy off the teachers at the expense of other state workers with an industry-specific wage raise. But thousands of teachers kept fighting until their demand was met with the exuberant support of their pupils and the wider public. This was a massive victory won in a state with a Republican governor, state Senate president, and House Majority Leader. Over the following 3 months, teachers in Oklahoma, Kentucky, North Carolina, Colorado, and Arizona followed suit, walking out of the classroom and winning victories for pay and school funding. Public sector pay has been backsliding for decades across the U.S. under both Republican and Democratic governors. Pay raises became a reality only when teachers began to organize and fight. I've said this in earlier shows that if truck drivers joined the teachers, even though they seem ideologically misaligned, things would really start to change. So maybe, Thomas, you should write an article about that. And in 2020, the Black Lives Matter uprising has done far more to challenge racism than 8 years of a black president. It has also, as in the 1960s, helped to radicalize a new generation and has produced leading activists schooled in the practice of mass action. This mass politicization is the best development in U.S. politics for decades. Hear, hear. Global capitalism in 2020 has entered a crisis not seen for a century. The existing problems of staggering inequality, racist police violence, and an emboldened far right will all be compounded unless workers and the oppressed wage a struggle capable of pushing back against the depravities of modern capitalism and build socialist organizations fit for that purpose. None of this will be helped by holding illusions in a future Biden presidency or by trying to convince people the immediate task is to campaign and vote for a member of the establishment who has nothing to offer workers and the oppressed. Nothing. The trap of electoralism pacifies radical movements into the comfortable terrain of Democratic Party politics and disarms activists from building the kind of confrontational mass movements that are the key to radical reforms, regardless of whoever is sitting in the White House. As the preeminent historian of social change in the U.S., Howard Zinn, wrote in a 2005 piece for The Progressive, "Knowing the nature of the political and judicial system of this country, its inherent bias against the poor, against people of color, against dissidents, we cannot become dependent on the courts or on our political leadership. Our culture, the media, the educational system, tries to crowd out of our political consciousness everything except who will be elected president and who will be on the Supreme Court, as if these are the most important decisions we make. They are not. They deflect us from the most important job citizens have, which is to bring democracy alive by organizing, protesting, engaging in acts of civil disobedience that shake up the system."